So I welcome everybody. This is James Gallagher Gallery. So this is actually the first artist talk we've had since the pandemic started. We've been open. Yes, good, I like that. Without further ado, Lisa as well.
Thank you, James. I trained as an architect. I went to Penn undergraduate, and then I went to Washington University in St. Louis for architecture for graduate school. And I practiced for about 6 years. However, when I got out into the industry, we happened to be in a recession. So there actually wasn't a lot of great work for architects. So what happened was a lot of the established firms were also finding it difficult for the, getting work, getting commissions. And so they started to design furniture and furnishings, almost a natural extension. And as a newbie in the industry, I witnessed this trend of major architects like Michael Graves and Richard Meyer and Frank Gehry suddenly designing product. So because I was working, but the work wasn't interesting, and I started to see all these products come into the market, I thought, well, maybe my background also allowed me to design some of these. So I started to go to trade shows to learn more about it. It's an interesting kind of, schooling by reading trade journals and going to trade shows and learning about the gift industry and the bed and bath industry and the stationery industry. And so I happened to meet a designer who was designing what is called domestics. Domestics are sheets and towels and dinnerware. And he was working in cut paper. He was a trained artist, went to RISD, worked in many media, but when I met him, he was working in cut paper. And when I was an architect and in architecture school, I was learning how to draw, and I wasn't very good. I had no natural ability for drawing. I absolutely could not paint. So when I figured, how am I going to express myself as a designer, I saw this cut paper technique and I adopted it. And that was probably 40 years ago. And I've been working in cut paper for 40 years. I have more than one pair of scissors, so. So I put together kind of a portfolio of lots of different ideas, dinnerware, trash cans, tea kettles, a whole lot of things. Took my portfolio to the trade shows, and back then the design directors would come to the trade shows and they would look at your portfolio, and if they liked your work, they would commission you to design a collection. So that's how I got into the industry. And over 35 years, I probably worked for about 50 different manufacturers designing their products, mostly doing what is called surface design. So I wasn't an industrial designer, I wasn't designing the shapes per se, but they would have the product and I would design what would go on the surface. So one of the things I decided to do was, because architecture was my background and I really loved buildings, I went to a store called the American Institute of Architects bookstore. And that bookstore, which was located in Center City, did a lot of products that were based on Philadelphia. And I showed them my work, and they said, will you do a collection of note cards based on the architecture of the city? So for multiple years, I did that. I would design, and that was just one account that I had, but I designed these note cards, of Boathouse Row and of City Hall and, a cityscape of a collage of buildings. I went to the Historic District. And one day, this is one of my products. This is a paper clock. I did a line of paper clocks at one point, and this was my Philadelphia clock. but I did one for the Philadelphia Museum of Art as well that was in the shape of their building. So this is actually got all kinds of imagery of the city, and it was all done in cut paper, the original artwork. Thank you.
It's very poppy now, that's why it gathered my attention.
Yeah, James was collecting my work before he even knew about me. I continued to get more work doing these architecture-themed note cards. I did them for the president of the University of Pennsylvania. I did her holiday cards based on the architecture of the campus. Then the Philadelphia Museum of Art, I designed multiple cards for them, all of different images of the building. And then the images were also put on T-shirts and posters and things like that. So so along the way, as I was designing, I was also collecting. I started collecting a lot of these very cool objects. So I called my collection the Antiques of the Future, because I thought I was collecting the best of design today, and once it was no longer in production, it would go up in value. And my collection I would talk about all the time. I collected tea kettles and trash cans and toilet brushes and all kinds of things that were designed by renowned architects and designers. They were showing up in museums, they were winning design awards. And people asked me, you know, how do we see your collection? So I wrote a book called Antiques of the Future. And after I wrote the book, I traveled around the country speaking, and I was approached by a TV production company that said, we love your story about how you make design accessible to a broad audience. We'd like to do a TV series, so I was in a TV series. And then I wrote a second book and a third book, actually, which was about my cat and design, called Mr. Waffles Loves Design. And then I did a fourth book. So I was, during COVID, when COVID first started in 2020, before it started in the beginning of 2020, I had been designing for so many companies. I had written 3 books, and I said, I have one more phase of my career. What do I want to do? And I decided I wanted to do these intensive architecture and interior cut papers. So I tried to identify who's the market for that. And I said, well, hotels oftentimes have note cards in the hotel rooms. So I started approaching hotels, and they loved the idea, and I started getting work with hotels. And then COVID hit, and nobody was going to hotels. So it completely obliterated this new market that I had identified. And then I'm thinking like, well, okay, now what? And then I started talking to some friends, and I said, how about a house portrait? You know, you've just moved to a new house, you're leaving your house and you want to remember it. So I started doing house portraits. And for the very first time in my career, I started posting on Instagram my house portraits in my hotels. And that's when James spotted me. So I had never done that before. James contacted me and said, you know, I really like your work. Can I come and see more of it? And I said, well, you know, I'm not an artist. I'm a designer. Every single thing I do turns into a product. I don't do it as art. I don't think about it as framing it and putting it on the wall. So he said, but I see you as an artist. And so he came to my studio, and I said, well, you know, this is all commission-based. I don't have like a body of work lying around. And he said, well, you have a year. Why don't you create a new body of work? And while I'm going through showing him some of the older projects I had, he spotted these illustrations for my new book. And he said, which is this whole section over there, he said, what about these? And I said, oh, well, they're just, you know, the illustrations for my book. They're just going to sit in my flat file. I'm not doing anything with them because they've already been reproduced. I don't need them anymore. And he said, well, I think these are art. And they're particularly art when you leave the pencil lines in to show your process. So I said, okay, you can have them. So this show comprises 3 stages of my work. First, a new whole set of architecture and interiors, mostly interiors. Then my book illustrations. And halfway through the year, I'm doing one interior after another. And I said, you know, I've done these so many times. I'm personally not growing. I can do, you know, when I do an interior, I take a photograph, I look at it, I interpret it out of cut paper. I leave out things that I don't think are necessary for communicating what is actually going on. And so it's my own personal interpretation of something that actually exists. In some ways, there's a crossover between Matthew and me. We are co-opting existing material and we are changing it somewhat, but we want it to be recognizable and identifiable from its original source. So in this halfway through the year where I'm cranking one of these out after another, I decided to stop and say, I need to do something completely different. So somebody asked me and said to me, well, actually, if you're now an artist, who are you as an artist? You know who you are as a designer, but who are you as an artist? So I thought about it and I said, I'm essentially 2 things. I'm only 2 things. One is, I am about color. Color is the thing that is present in every piece I do. It's the most important thing, is picking the right colors and having people relate to the color palette. And the other thing is my medium. I only know how to do one thing. I can't draw, I can't paint, I can't do computer design. I can cut out little pieces of paper. So cut paper, my medium, and the impact of color. So one other thing I'm going to say, and then we'll walk around, is I have something called synesthesia. Synesthesia is when one sense communicates to another sense. So we have 5 senses. And synesthesia, for me, which I didn't even know the name of it, but I knew I had it, was I react to color. I get a physiological reaction to color. And it's not looking at a single color. It's when the color palette is put together and it's right. I feel it. I feel color. So that has been my guide for my abstracts, which is the 3rd part of this show. So I want to start with my interiors, which is this section over here. Usually I've done these for people, so they give me a photograph of their home or of their space. But this time I worked off of magazine articles and my travel photos. And because I wasn't doing them for anybody, I started changing them around. So again, a little bit like Matthew, this was a magazine article and the colors were completely different. So this was like from a design magazine. I changed all the colors, I changed the accessories, I basically redecorated. And you'll see there's a cat in a lot of them. That's my cat, Mr. Waffles. He kind of shows up in a lot of the interiors. But because I didn't have somebody saying, well, you got that wrong, I could do whatever I wanted. So there was a freedom suddenly with this group of interiors. This is a very famous house in Mexico. There was a Mexican architect named Luis Barragan. And when he passed away, his house became a museum. And this was just, I went to that museum and that was one of my photographs. And these are a variety of, my Japanese ones were a hotel that I stayed at, but they definitely didn't have those colors. They were sort of blacks and grays and whites, so I came in and completely changed the color palette. I put in this little thing here. I faked the Japanese writing. I have no idea that that means anything. This was, I was in Holland in a farmhouse, and this is a Dutch farmhouse, so I was actually there. This is in Maine. And so these, and this was an advertisement. So these were all things that I had something basic to work with, and then I went off and I changed and redecorated. This section here this is from my book. It's called What is Good Design? A Simple Question Without a Simple Answer, and there's the cover. So this is a book that is intended to introduce the concept of good design to people, and I look at 7 characteristics of good design, and then I use examples of what is good design. So obviously the Swiss Army knife is something that's been around for years, and they keep elaborating it where they add more and more elements, but it's basically, you know, one little object that is incredibly multifunctional. Great design. The Lumos helmet, this is a relatively new design. It's got a digital display on the back that you can manipulate, and it can turn into an arrow. So if you're making a left or a right, the back of your helmet can let the driver know that you're going left or right, or it can blink to let you know that you're stopping. And then there's a light in the front that actually projects pretty far so that you can see in front of you. This is a fabulous design. The hardest one of all of these objects for me to cut out of paper was the folding bicycle. And this is when in its folded position, because it's layer on layer. It's 3 layers of a bicycle. That's, you know, the spokes against spokes. And how do you, you know, take a chance at, you know, I mean, when you have a chance to look at it, it's readable. You know what that folded bike is doing, but it was incredibly complicated to put in just the right amount of elements, especially when they're the same color. And I did a slightly darker gray in the back and a slightly lighter gray in the front so that you could see the dimensional. And then this is my third category. And this is what I was talking about in terms of color, is that I start with picking out the papers. Nothing's painted here. These are all colored papers. I probably have 800 or 900 colored papers, and I keep them in my flat files organized by color. So there's a folder for every color. And then I pull out the colors and I, you know, assemble them in strips and then readjust them until I get the relationship and the balance of color. And one of the things that I did with both of these, and I do this as a common thing, is that I pick a color palette, and here I wanted gray, yellow, and red. And then I added the blue in to give it a little bit of tension, to give it depth, to give it some kind of edge to it. It brings it to life by putting just the completely different color in with it. And the same with this one, where I put in the red, that you don't really notice that it kind of doesn't relate to the other colors. What you notice is that there's some energy there. And this, I actually feel, I mean, my eye looks at that and I get a feeling. And then if we look at this group down here, one of the things I like to do is I like to do companion pieces. So I'll do it in one colorway and then I'll do a second colorway, kind of to see how a design changes when it's using a different color palette. Or can I get the same energy level by completely changing the colors? And then this group here are my triptychs. And I started with the top one. And when I did it, it wasn't a triptych. I just wanted to see what it would be like to have different bands of color. And when I finished it, I thought it was extremely boring. So I took these white strips and I put it over it to kind of cut it up. And it came to life. And I analyzed why did it change so much by separating out the elements. And I realized that there's, you know, with an abstract, at least in my mind, you want to hold the viewer's attention for the longest period of time. You don't want them to look at it and get it and then walk on. You want them to look at it and something keeps the eye there. So what keeps your eye here is the fact that your eye is trying to fill in the gap. And the other thing is, these three elements are not the same size. So there's something going on there that's creating a little tension. And then when you look at these bodies of color, I did the same thing. I put one color in there that's kind of different than all the other colors to kind of give it movement. So that's what I did with that one. Then I did the second one, and I wanted to do something different with it than the first one, so I left the edges ragged. And that added another element to it that gave it interest. And then when I came to this one, I said, I really want to challenge myself, because I picked a color, my least favorite color, which is beige. My eye just does not see beige. And so I picked the ugliest beige that I have. And I said, I'm going to find a way to make that beige come to life. And so the base of this is beige. Then I picked browns and taupey colors, and that was my first layering. Then I put the reds and the pinks, again sort of in that warm family, but you know, looked really good with beige. And then I dotted it with these orange pieces, which really started to perk it out. But then I said, it needs one more thing. And I took these little blue elements, completely different than everything else on there. I made them small, I scattered them around, and suddenly it had movement. So that my eye sees that. My eye knows that it's finished or it's not finished. And when I did that blue, the whole thing felt like a complete color story. So my interest at this stage in my career is, I know I can do those architecture and interior things, there's no challenge, but I'm just getting started with the abstracts. And where I'm at right now is I'm starting to weave paper. So I'm making these woven things. And again, it's a whole mass of color. And I am forever indebted to James, who opened up this path for me, which I never in a million years thought I would be on. And having a show in a gallery was never on my bucket list. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thanks for covering that